Edward said. The manuscript feels alive. His fingers trembled as he touched the ancient vellum bound in cracked leather. The dim light of the library lamp threw sharp shadows across his face. He had searched for this for years, chasing whispers and dead ends until tonight. The Voynich Manuscript rested before him, its faded ink glowing faintly in the amber light. Edward's heart pounded as if the book itself spoke to him. He remembered the archivist's warning. Some knowledge is not meant to be found. But he could not turn back now. Each page was filled with symbols, plants, and diagrams no one alive could read. His obsession burned like fire. He whispered, "I will find your meaning." The room seemed to shiver, as if something unseen stirred in the silence. The air grew heavy, and the lamp flickered. A shadow moved in the corner, but Edward's eyes stayed on the text. The scent of old parchment mixed with dust filled his lungs. He felt he was no longer alone. Edward sat hunched at the desk, scribbling notes furiously as the symbols consumed his thoughts. His mind chased every curve, every pattern, desperate for meaning. He muttered, "There must be a key." The lamp's light wavered, making the letters seem to crawl across the page. Hours slipped past unnoticed. The library grew colder, the silence broken only by his frantic scratching of pen against paper. His hands ached, but obsession fueled him. He thought of scholars who failed before him, those who went mad staring at the same pages. "I will not fail," Edward said through clenched teeth. He glanced at his scattered notes, a labyrinth of sketches and guesses. His pulse raced as though the manuscript whispered promises of secrets. Outside, the wind pressed against the ancient windows, rattling faintly. Edward's eyes burned, his breath shallow, his will fixed. He felt the boundary between reason and madness thinning, yet he pressed on. The heavy door creaked open, and Margaret stepped in, her voice sharp. "Edward, what have you dragged me into this time?" She was cautious yet drawn by his summons. Edward looked up, shadows deep under his eyes. "Margaret, I need your mind. You see patterns where others see nothing." She crossed her arms, uneasy. "Or maybe I see danger you refuse to acknowledge." The tension thickened as the chill from outside followed her in. The lamp's glow fell on her concerned face. Edward said, "If we unlock this, history changes." Margaret replied, "Or we unravel ourselves." The room pulsed with their opposing wills, obsession against caution, fire meeting ice. He leaned forward, whispering, "You're the only one I trust." Her hesitation cracked, though fear lingered in her eyes. She sighed, "Then show me what you've found." The first alliance, fragile as glass, had begun in the quiet of that haunted library. Margaret leaned closer, eyes scanning the strange symbols. "These drawings feel like maps," she murmured. Edward's excitement surged. "Yes, maps to something lost." He pointed at repeating circles and spirals. "See how they align with the constellations?" Margaret frowned, doubt mixing with intrigue. "Or they are illusions of meaning." Edward replied, "Every illusion is born of truth." The air grew heavier, their breath visible as cold crept deeper into the room. The manuscript seemed to hum beneath their fingers, alive with secrets. Edward's voice dropped. "Someone hid this for a reason." Margaret whispered, "And someone may want it to stay hidden." Their words hung in silence, more powerful than the flicker of the lamp. The mystery had taken hold of them both, binding them with threads of fear and wonder. The night outside pressed hard against the walls as the manuscript glowed faintly under their touch. The library's silence shattered with a sudden crash. Edward jerked upright, heart racing. A book had fallen from a high shelf, though no one touched it. Margaret stiffened. "We're not alone." Shadows stretched unnaturally as the lamp flickered. Edward's voice hardened. "Something watches." He scanned the corners, every instinct screaming. Margaret whispered, "This is madness." He replied, "No, this is proof." His eyes locked on the darkness where movement had stirred. The air felt charged, as though invisible eyes bore into them. Margaret clutched her coat tighter, fear plain. Edward steadied himself. If someone wants to keep this secret, they've already failed. His words sounded braver than he felt. The crash still echoed in the silence, a warning, unheeded. The mystery had awakened, and its keeper had stirred. The night would not let them go so easily. Edward bent over the manuscript again, his breath fogging in the chilled air. The symbols teased him with hidden meaning, dancing like riddles on the page. "I see fragments," he whispered. Margaret's sharp voice broke the silence. "Fragments can break you apart." He rubbed his temples, exhaustion burning through his eyes. Hours had passed but felt like minutes. The lamp hissed faintly, fighting the darkness. Edward muttered, "I need to dig deeper." Margaret leaned against the shelf, her coat drawn tight. "You're digging into a grave." His mind refused to yield. He traced spirals on the page, linking them to constellations, imagining ancient stargazers drawing them centuries ago. He felt history pressing its weight on his shoulders. Margaret's gaze softened, though her doubt lingered. "You chase ghosts." Edward answered firmly, "Ghosts hold the truth." The silence that followed pressed heavier than the night, as though the walls themselves listened. Margaret finally pushed herself from the shadows. "Edward, you've lost sleep, you've lost sense. This obsession will kill you." He shook his head, determination etched into his face. "Or it will reveal everything." Her voice softened, but carried warning. "You want meaning so badly that you'll twist nonsense into truth." He slammed his notes shut, frustration sparking. "You don't see it because you're afraid." Her jaw tightened. "Fear keeps us alive." He paced, hands tugging at his hair, muttering about ciphers and codes, the room echoing with his fevered energy. Margaret caught his arm. "Stop before this consumes you." For a moment, he faltered, seeing her fear mirrored in her eyes. His heart pounded with conflict. Then he whispered, "If I stop now, I lose everything I am." The silence wrapped around them like chains, each word heavier than the last, binding them to the growing mystery. The silence fractured as a low voice drifted from the doorway. A tall stranger cloaked in black stepped into the light. His eyes gleamed with strange knowledge. "You seek what others feared to touch," he said smoothly. Edward's breath caught. Margaret stepped forward defensively. "Who are you?" The man smiled faintly. "An informant. I carry truths others bury." His presence unsettled the air, as though the night itself bent around him. Edward's obsession sharpened. "Then, speak." The stranger shook his head. "Truth is not a gift. It is a curse. I will give you fragments, but at a cost." Margaret hissed, "This is madness, Edward." He ignored her, leaning closer. The man whispered of hidden libraries, secret orders, and maps written in stars. Edward's veins burned with anticipation. Margaret stared at the intruder with dread. The stranger's smile widened, cryptic and cold. The mystery had a new voice now. The stranger spread a scrap of parchment across the desk. Edward's heart hammered as he recognized the same spirals and circles from the manuscript. "These are not words," the man said. "They are maps." Edward traced the symbols, eyes alight with revelation. "Hidden paths," he murmured. Margaret stiffened. "Paths to where?" The man's voice dropped. "To knowledge guarded in shadows." The lamp flickered violently, and cold crept deeper into the room. Margaret whispered, "We shouldn't follow this." Edward snapped, "We must!" His obsession roared higher, drowning her warning. The parchment symbols seemed alive, shifting under the light. Edward whispered to himself, "The stars guide us still." The outsider chuckled. "Every map leads to danger. Will you walk it?" Edward clenched his jaw, unwilling to back down. Margaret's eyes burned with fear and frustration, but she knew he was already lost to the pull. The trap was set. The outsider slipped into the shadows, leaving silence and unease. Edward whispered, "We're closer now than ever." Margaret's eyes hardened. Closer to what? Madness? Death? He gathered the parchment and the manuscript, his hands shaking with zeal. To the truth. Suddenly, the air shifted. A faint sound echoed from the far shelves, footsteps where none should be. Margaret froze, fear flashing across her face. Edward turned sharply, eyes narrowing at the darkness. Keeper knows we're here. The library groaned under invisible weight. The lamp dimmed, shadows stretching unnaturally long. Margaret whispered, "Then we're already hunted." Edward steadied himself, defiance burning in his gaze. "Then let the hunter come. I'll not turn back." His voice trembled, yet held conviction. The unseen presence lingered like a warning, heavy and suffocating. The chase had begun, and there would be no safety left in silence. Edward and Margaret followed the faint trail the outsider hinted at, leading them to an abandoned church on the city's edge. The heavy doors groaned as Edward pushed them open. Dust swirled in the moonlight streaming through shattered stained glass. At the altar, a lone figure sat with head bowed. Edward whispered, "A survivor." Margaret's eyes softened. The man raised his face, hollow and worn, scars carved across his cheeks. His voice cracked. "I lived where others were silenced." His trembling hands clutched a faded locket. Edward stepped closer, sensing a key in his sorrow. The man continued, "They took everything, my family, my sanity, because of this book." Margaret's voice faltered. "You were part of it." His eyes brimmed with tears. "I was the price they paid." Edward's obsession sharpened, but Margaret's heart ached at his pain. The tragedy bound itself to the mystery, sealing their path forward. Edward leaned closer to the man, his voice taut. "Tell me what you know." The man's gaze drifted to the locket in his hand. "This belonged to my daughter. She was taken because of the manuscript." Margaret's breath caught. The candle Edward lit flickered, revealing carvings etched into the church walls, symbols identical to those in the book. The man whispered, "They forced me to draw them, to copy pages I never understood." Edward's eyes widened. "You were part of its survival." The man nodded weakly. "And my daughter was the cost." Silence fell heavy. Margaret whispered, "She may be the victim, Edward." His jaw clenched as the puzzle pieces shifted in his mind. The church seemed alive with echoes of grief. Edward said, "Her story is buried in the ink. We will find it." The man's tears slipped quietly, each drop a wound carved by history itself. Tension flared as Margaret turned on Edward. "Do you even hear him? His suffering is a warning, not an invitation." Edward's eyes burned with obsession. Every tragedy leads to truth. She stepped back, frustration shaking her voice. "You're blind, Edward. This book is devouring you." His fists clenched as he shouted, "I can't stop now. If I turn away, their deaths mean nothing." Margaret's voice softened but remained firm. "And if you keep going, you'll join them." Her words pierced through the air, echoing in the ruined church. The tragic figure looked on, sorrow deepening at the reflection of his own downfall. Edward's face tightened, torn between fury and despair. The silence that followed was jagged, their partnership trembling under the weight of obsession and caution. Margaret finally whispered, "If you fall, I won't be able to save you." Her warning lingered as Edward turned back to the book. The silence shattered as the outsider's voice drifted from the shadows of the church. "Pain breeds truth." He stepped forward, cloak brushing the ground, eyes gleaming coldly. Edward's pulse quickened. "What more do you know?" The man smirked. "Only what you're ready to suffer for." Margaret spat. "You enjoy tormenting him." The outsider tilted his head, amused. "I only reveal what the stars already sing." He slid a parchment toward Edward, marked with constellations tied to unknown locations. "The answers lie where light never reaches." Edward clutched the parchment, obsession blazing. Margaret whispered, "Don't trust him." Edward's eyes never left the cryptic lines. The outsider's grin widened. "The keeper already moves against you. Choose your path before it is chosen for you." The church seemed to darken, shadows crawling along the walls. Edward's hands shook as he held the clue, both a gift and a curse. The tragic figure gasped suddenly, clutching his chest as if struck by unseen force. Edward rushed to him, but Margaret froze at the sound of shifting stone in the darkness. A shadow moved across the wall, long and unnatural. Edward shouted, "The keeper is here." The man whispered, "They never let the truth go." His locket slipped from his hand, clattering on the altar. Margaret pulled Edward back. "We have to leave now." Edward's teeth clenched. Not without answers. The church trembled as dust fell from the rafters. A presence pressed heavy, suffocating, as though the walls themselves breathed. The tragic figure cried out, "Run!" before collapsing, his body limp. Edward stared in horror, fury and grief twisting inside him. Margaret dragged him toward the doors as the shadows swelled. Behind them, the silence swallowed the church, and the keeper's power pulsed unseen in the dark corners of the night. The night wind howled as Edward and Margaret staggered into a candlelit chamber beneath the ruined church. From the shadows emerged a figure with familiar warmth. Daniel, a scholar Edward once trusted, stepped forward with a calm smile. "You've come far, Edward," he said smoothly. Margaret's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "How do you know this place?" Daniel's gaze never wavered. "Because I've walked this path before you." Edward's face flickered with relief. "Then you can help us." Daniel inclined his head. "Yes. Though the truth carries weight heavier than you imagine." Margaret's whisper cut sharp. "Be careful, Edward." But her words fell against Edward's swelling hope. The chamber walls glimmered faintly with inscriptions, symbols echoing the manuscript. Daniel's presence radiated confidence, yet beneath it lay an edge too polished, too rehearsed. Edward leaned closer, unaware of the web tightening around him. In the dark, the first seeds of betrayal stirred. Edward pressed Daniel for answers, his voice eager. "What do these symbols mean?" Daniel studied the markings with practiced ease. "They are keys, guiding those worthy to the hidden knowledge." Margaret's eyes hardened. "And who decides who is worthy?" Daniel smirked faintly. "Those willing to risk everything." Edward leaned closer, gripping his notes tightly. "Then show me." Margaret grabbed his arm, her voice sharp. "Don't trust him. He's too ready with answers." Daniel's gaze slid toward her, cool and dismissive. "Fear blinds the cautious. Truth requires boldness." Edward's heart pounded with excitement, his obsession mounting. Margaret's warning echoed in the chamber, but Edward's focus burned solely on Daniel's words. Daniel's smile deepened, concealing secrets behind it. "The path will demand more than you are ready to give." Edward whispered, "I will give all of it." The tension bound them in a fragile triangle of trust, doubt, and deception. Margaret's unease deepened as Daniel guided Edward toward a stone pedestal in the center of the chamber. Ancient carvings glowed faintly as the manuscript was placed atop it. Daniel said, "The text responds only to belief." Edward's hands trembled as he touched the pages, the symbols shimmering faintly. Margaret whispered urgently, "It's dangerous. Stop this." Edward ignored her, transfixed by the glow. Daniel's eyes gleamed with hidden satisfaction. "The manuscript awakens in your hands, Edward. You were chosen." Edward's breath caught as the pages shifted like living skin. Margaret pulled him back, shouting, "He's feeding your madness." Edward yanked free, tears of obsession streaking his face. "I can see it. Answers within reach." Daniel folded his arms, watching like a puppeteer pulling strings. The room pulsed with an unseen rhythm, ancient and menacing. Margaret's fear deepened. She realized Daniel's calm facade hid a trap. The manuscript's glow intensified, symbols lifting like smoke into the air. Edward gasped, reaching toward them. Margaret cried out, "Edward, stop!" But Daniel's voice was smooth and steady. "Let it consume you. Only then will truth emerge." Edward's eyes filled with awe, chasing shapes twisting above him. Margaret lunged forward, pulling at his arm. "He's using you." Daniel's smile remained cold. "The manuscript answers only to the devoted." The air thickened, crackling with unnatural energy. Edward's body shook as his obsession reached fever pitch. "I can almost understand," he whispered. Margaret fought against both Edward's resistance and Daniel's manipulative calm. "You'll destroy yourself," she shouted. Daniel tilted his head, eyes gleaming with calculation. "Or he will transcend." The chamber's light flared violently, shadows swirling like predators. Edward's heart pounded, caught between loyalty to Margaret's voice of reason and the seductive whispers of Daniel's poisoned guidance. Suddenly, the glow collapsed into darkness. The chamber plunged into suffocating silence. Edward staggered, sweat pouring down his face. Margaret steadied him, glaring at Daniel. "You knew this would happen." Daniel shrugged smoothly. "Every revelation requires sacrifice." Edward gasped. "What did I see?" Daniel's smile lingered. "Fragments of truth, just enough to bind you tighter." Margaret's anger flared. "You manipulate him, twisting his obsession for your gain." Daniel's voice cooled. "Obsession is the only key strong enough to unlock what lies beyond." Edward stared at both of them, torn, his body trembling. Margaret pleaded, "Edward, listen to me. He's not your ally." But Edward's silence betrayed his inner conflict. His gaze locked on the manuscript, now dark but pulsing faintly. Daniel stepped back into the shadows, his voice echoing. "Choose wisely, Edward. The Keeper already moves, and your hesitation will be your downfall." The trap had been sprung. Edward sat trembling in the flickering chamber light, staring at the manuscript that no longer glowed, but pulsed faintly like a heart. His voice cracked. "Something is wrong. The symbols contradict themselves." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Contradiction is the language of madness." Edward clutched his notes, pages filled with chaotic sketches and failed translations. "No, it's a cipher hiding inside a cipher." Margaret shook her head. "Or it's nothing, and you're breaking yourself trying to force sense from nonsense." Edward slammed his hand on the pedestal. "It means something." The chamber echoed with his desperation. Margaret whispered, "You're unraveling." The faint sound of dripping water filled the silence as Edward pressed his forehead against the parchment. I can't stop now. If I don't solve this, then everything is meaningless." The book seemed to taunt him, every mark twisting deeper into his mind. The truth had begun to crumble. The sound of slow footsteps echoed through the chamber, and Edward turned sharply. From the shadows stepped Daniel, his calm facade cracking into a cruel smirk. "The truth you seek will break you." Edward's chest heaved. "You lied." Daniel spread his arms. "I guided you exactly where I wanted you." Margaret's fury erupted. "You were never his ally. You fed his obsession." Daniel chuckled darkly. "Obsession is the only path to revelation. And now you are mine." Edward's voice shook with rage. "You betrayed me." Daniel's smirk grew sharper. "Trust is the weakest chain, and you forged it yourself." Margaret stepped between them. "Stay away from him." Daniel's eyes glinted with power, shadows tightening around him. Edward's grief burned into fury, betrayal slashing deeper than any wound. The chamber trembled as the Keeper's presence stirred through Daniel's words, a clear sign he was no mere scholar but a deceiver. Edward's chest tightened, grief crashing against rage. He shouted, "I trusted you, Daniel." Daniel's smirk deepened. "And that trust opened the door I needed." Margaret's voice cut sharp. "He played you, Edward. He always intended this." Edward's hands shook as he gripped the manuscript. Daniel stepped closer, voice dripping with venom. "Do you think you can solve it? Even your mind is not strong enough." Edward's eyes blazed, his obsession reaching a breaking point. "Then I'll prove you wrong." Margaret pleaded, "Don't let him drag you further." Edward ignored her, turning to the manuscript as if Daniel's betrayal only fueled him. Daniel whispered, "Yes, destroy yourself for truth. That's the way of all seekers." Edward's tears burned as he pressed his hands to the pages, his will torn between despair and determination. The chamber pulsed with energy, the weight of betrayal threatening to crush him entirely. The manuscript's pages shifted under Edward's touch, as if alive. Strange diagrams bled into new shapes, revealing a hidden symbol that matched the carvings in the ruined church. Margaret gasped. The catalyst. It was always him. Edward's voice shook. The tragic figure wasn't just a victim. His family's blood sealed this mystery. Daniel's cold laugh echoed. Yes, his suffering was the foundation, the sacrifice required. Edward's face twisted with horror and realization. Margaret whispered, "He was the key all along." The locket's memory burned in Edward's mind, the man's cries ringing in his ears. His obsession sharpened, but sorrow pierced through. Edward whispered, "His loss cannot be in vain." Daniel stepped closer, triumphant. "Now you understand. Pain fuels truth." Margaret shook her head violently. "Pain is not truth, it's corruption." The chamber felt like a tomb, the tragedy binding itself to every wall, every shadow that lingered. The chamber roared with sudden energy, the keeper's unseen presence coiling like smoke around them. Edward steadied himself, defiance battling despair. "If the keeper wants me broken, he will fail." Daniel's smirk faltered slightly, but his voice remained confident. "You are already breaking." Margaret's grip tightened on Edward's shoulder. "We must leave before this destroys you." But Edward's eyes blazed with obsession. "No, I have come too far." The manuscript pulsed violently, symbols spinning like stars collapsing into blackness. Daniel's laughter returned, though thinner now. "Yes, burn yourself for the truth you crave." The air grew suffocating, shadows wrapping around Edward's arms like chains. Margaret cried, "Edward, fight it!" He shouted into the darkness, "I will not stop until the truth is mine." His voice echoed, mixing with the rumble of unseen power. The keeper's trap had closed, and Edward stood at its heart, unyielding and doomed. The chamber doors creaked, and Elena stepped from the stairwell, her voice soft as snowfall. "Edward, you never learned when to stop." His breath caught at the sound of her name. Margaret stiffened, measuring the distance between them. Elena's eyes held history and heat, a ruin and a refuge. Edward said, "Why are you here?" She smiled with old affection and new purpose. "To keep you alive, or to keep you from what kills you." Margaret's tone cut clean. "Which is it tonight?" Elena glanced at the manuscript, reading Edward's hunger like a map. "But you always chase the abyss," she murmured. He whispered, "And you always pulled me back." The words tasted like ash. Elena stepped closer, palm hovering above the pages. "This book devours love before it feeds you truth." The room breathed with their tangled past, and something hidden shifted behind her careful kindness. They moved to the side corridor where the air tasted of damp stone and regret. Elena said, "You left me for riddles only ink can answer." Edward flinched. "I left because the questions would not stop." Margaret's gaze sharpened, reading old scars in every word. Elena traced a sigil on the wall, the mark from the church repeating here. "The keeper plants mirrors," she warned. Edward answered, "Mirrors still reflect truth." Her laugh held sorrow. "Or they reflect the face you want to see." Margaret stepped between them. "If you know the path, speak it plain." Elena's eyes dimmed. Plain paths lead to plain graves. Edward felt the cipher twist like wire around his heart. He said, "Help me break it, or step aside." Elena's whisper bled with pain. "You never ask what breaking it breaks in you." Silence hung like a blade above all three. A soft knock echoed, then the outsider glided from a shadowed arch like night-given bones. "You gather old flames and fresh fears," he said. Elena's jaw set. "I know your voice from darker rooms." Edward asked, "Whose side are you on?" The outsider smiled, starless and thin. "I am on the side of endings." Margaret snapped, "He deals in fragments and debts." The outsider unfurled a vellum scrap, constellations laced to dates and tides. "A window opens," he murmured. "When the lamp dies and the bells answer." Edward felt the timing click against the chamber's pulse. Elena whispered, "It's a snare." The outsider bowed slightly. "All doors are snares when truth waits behind them." "Mighty." Edward took the scrap, hands shaking with need. Margaret's eyes begged restraint. The night pressed closer, and choices hardened like cooling iron. Something irreversible waited at the next turn. They ran the tunnels as if chased by their former selves, boots slapping slick stone. Bells tolled above, a distant clock calling the hour. The vellum star map matched each turn with cruel precision. Edward said, left at the broken lintel. Elena grabbed his sleeve. "This is the keeper's rhythm," Margaret urged. "Move, then break the rhythm." A rush of cold air announced an exit stair. They burst into a cloister yard drowned in moonlight. Daniel waited there, smile thin as wire. "You bring me what I need," he purred. Edward lifted the manuscript, fury burning. Margaret whispered, "He wants the trade." Elena circled wide, hands low, eyes measuring the dark. Daniel stepped forward and the ground shuddered. Stone split near the well, throwing Edward off balance. The manuscript skidded across wet grass. The trap snapped, and the night swallowed their advantage whole. A small leather pouch rolled from Daniel's coat during the lurch, spilling a locket twin to the tragic figure's keepsake. Edward froze. Inside gleamed a faded photo of Clara, the missing daughter, eyes bright with vanished summers. He whispered, "She was here." Daniel's voice cooled. "Suffering oils the gears of revelation." Elena hissed, "Monster." Margaret's breath shook. "Where is she?" Daniel's smile did not reach his eyes. Every map requires a sacrifice. The bells tolled again, and distant footsteps answered. Many and disciplined. Edward felt the world narrow to a blade. "You used her to bind the text." Daniel tilted his head. "Pain clarifies." Edward's grief detonated into jagged resolve. "Then I will unbind it and take her back." The knight recoiled as he stepped between Daniel and the book. The hunt was no longer for pages alone, it was for a stolen life. Moonlight pooled across the cloister as Daniel advanced with priestly calm. Edward raised the manuscript like a shield and said, "You do not own this truth." Daniel's smile thinned. "Truth owns you." Margaret stepped near Edward, voice steady. "Walk back from the edge." Elena circled, eyes fixed on Daniel's hands. He whispered, "Give me the book and I will end the pain." Edward felt Clara's gaze in the locket image burning his heart. He said, "The book is bound to her fate." The outsider's voice drifted from an arch. "Endings have arrived." Wind rattled the palms, bells answered in iron notes. Edward breathed deep and chose the harder road. "No bargains," he said. The night drew tight as wire, and the last act began to turn. Daniel spread his arms as if blessing a congregation. Clara opened the door you could not. Edward's rage steadied into ice. "Where is she?" Daniel's voice softened. "Between pages, where devotion cures doubt." Margaret snapped, "You caged her to feed your creed." Elena moved closer and said, "Release her or lose everything." The outsider hummed. "A trade binds the hinge." Edward set the locket on the grass and whispered, "I unbind my claim." The manuscript shivered, ink loosening like thawed rivers. Daniel hissed, "Fool, you sever your last anchor." Edward answered, "Then I choose hers." The bell struck, and the cipher's lock groaned. Pages fluttered without wind, and a hidden folio slid free like a breath. A girl's sketch stared back, lively eyes annotated with star maps. Edward whispered, "Clara, I see you." The air rippled, and a faint step echoed from the nave. Daniel lunged, but Margaret intercepted with a hard shove. Elena traced a counter-sigil in the dirt and said, "Break the circle he built." The outsider murmured numbers like tides. Edward aligned the folio with the sky, symbols meeting a new geometry. He said, "Pain is not the key. Love remembers the pattern." The vellum warmed, and a lock gave way in the dark. A door hidden in the well wall slid open with a grinding sigh. A narrow chamber glowed with cold lamplight, and a figure stepped out, thin but standing. Clara's eyes matched the sketch. She whispered, "I followed the maps because he promised meaning." Daniel tried to claim the moment. "You are the miracle I forged." Clara flinched. Edward said, "You owe him nothing." Margaret's voice steadied the room. "Walk to us." Elena opened her palms. "Choose your life, not his legend." Clara's breath calmed as she crossed the threshold. Daniel's composure cracked into fury. The keeper's hush fell like ash, and the choice sealed itself. Daniel struck for the manuscript, but Edward let it fall closed and said, "Its power ends here." The outsider whispered, "So ends the circle." Margaret seized the folio and tore the binding knot. Symbols unraveled like birds from snare. Elena stepped between Daniel and Clara, voice low. "Your creed dies tonight." Daniel roared at the sky, and the bells answered with final iron. The glow faded from the pages, leaving only ink and time. Edward turned to Clara. "You are not a cipher." She nodded, tears bright. "I choose ordinary days." The wind softened, and the cloister became only stone again. Truth cost them scars, but it gave them back a life.